Okay, I will admit.
Okay, looks like everybody's in here from the waiting room. Thank you guys for waiting. We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you all to Illinois Learns to Hunt, the plant identification for Illinois hunters. Also just plant identification for anyone interested in identifying some plants. So before we get started tonight, just some housekeeping stuff we always go over. You do not need your microphones, so you can keep those muted. Also, you do not need your videos, so you can keep that off as well. So you just sit back and enjoy the presentation that Dan's going to give here. Also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can put that in the chat box where we told you that we'd be starting at 7 o'clock. You can just reply into that box and we'll see that and answer your question in the chat, or Dan during his presentation could answer it if he sees it in the presentation. And we have time at the end also for questions, so if any questions pop up, be it about plant identification or any hunting questions you may have about Illinois hunting, let us know and we can answer those for you at the end. If you have any audio issues, if our audio drops out at all, please put that in the chat so that way we know you can't hear us. So there is, Dan and myself are both on, so hopefully one of us will be connected to the Zoom meeting if one of us drops out. Also, please expect to see a survey and a PowerPoint presentation of this presentation will be emailed to you guys sometime next week, along with a video recording of this webinar as well. It might take a few days because we do send the videos out to get closed captioning added to them before we send them out. So expect you're going to, because this presentation is PowerPoint heavy, we're going to have different examples of the plants and how to identify them. So it's going to be a helpful PowerPoint to have. So we'll email that to you. Also, the survey, if you can go through that, we are going through making these webinars, and it helps us if you have any constructive criticism or anything like that to add to the survey. That would help us out in trying to focus these more and make them as educational as possible. With that, I'm Jason Buckley, and I'm just going to be doing the intros and outros and running the PowerPoint for Dan tonight, but our main presenter tonight is Dan Stevens. Dan, would you like to say hi?
Hello, everybody.
Great. So Dan is going to help us go through these plants. So the course outline. So we're going to go over identification techniques. We're going to talk about the leaf types, leaf arrangements, leaf margins, and the different types that you're going to see and how that helps you identify a plant. And we'll go over the nut-bearing and the fruit-bearing species, along with shrubs and woody vines species. And then, like I said, at the end, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those at the end or in the chat during the presentation. So with that, Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Jason. And like Jason mentioned, this is a really brief overview of plant identification. And it's important to remember, you know, there's thousands of species of plant in this country and a lot in Illinois as well. And so we're really going to focus on some of the more common species. And this webinar is going to specifically focus on woody plants. So that's going to be trees, shrubs, occasionally some woody vines, and some other plants kind of thrown in there. But we will have a part 2 coming out in a few weeks. We're going to have another webinar that's going to detail more of the herbaceous species. So a lot of your grasses, your sedges, your rushes, as well as some of the other kind of herbaceous plants. So wildflowers and different native forms and things like that. But first, it's kind of, you know, as I learned a hunt program, we really try to focus this geared towards hunters. And so one of the first things I like to point out is kind of why is this all important? You know, how can we use this in the, what I kind of call the hunt planning process? How can we utilize some of this information? And, you know, plant species are really dictated by what's on the landscape, and wildlife movement is then dictated by a lot of the plant communities that are on the landscape. So being able to identify different vegetation species and different kind of successional trends, and you'll kind of understand a few of these terms as we kind of dive into this topic a little bit, but it's just really important to be able to understand how different wildlife interact with these plants, whether it's eating them, whether it's using it as cover, or using it as part of their mating ritual. But plant life is very intertwined in terms of wildlife ecology, and that's something that hunters should really pay attention to. So first, we're going to start off with a few kind of terms that are really just some kind of background information and some terms that you're going to hear me utilize throughout this webinar. And so it's really important that we kind of establish what these terms mean up front. So obviously the leaves are very important on trees and on most plant species. Obviously they're crucial to gather energy, but they're also used for respiration and protection. But leaf identification is kind of utilizing the structure of the leaf to be able to use that to kind of influence your identification process. And so the types of leaves that we're going to cover. So first is the simple leaf. And just like the name says, this is kind of what most people think of as a leaf. When you kind of picture a leaf in your head, you typically think of a simple leaf. If we look at some of these other examples, you can see we have compound leaves. And a lot of individuals, I know when I first started looking at plant identification, this was really confusing to me because, you know, growing up, I would have called a lot of those things, you know, a branch with multiple leaves. But in fact, that whole structure that you're seeing there is the leaf, which has leaflets on the inside of the leaf. And so we'll go over kind of how to identify these things. But that can be a real basic fundamental characteristic is how is that leaf, kind of what is the leaf type of that individual plant that you're trying to identify. Another really common leaf type that you're going to see is the palmately compound. So that's kind of what, if you think of clover, that, you know, it's kind of got those three whorled leaves coming off a single stem. That's a good example of a palmately compound. Then you also have a pinnately compound. So we actually have several different types of compound leaves. So we have the palmately compound, and then we have the pinnately compound. And so as we kind of carry through this discussion, you'll start to see how important each of these different leaf types are in terms of identification. But now that we got some of this basic terminology, I want to move on to leaf arrangement. So not only is the leaf type important, but also how that individual leaf is arranged on the stem is crucial. And so we're going to cover kind of the more basic classifications of leaf arrangement. And the first and arguably the most common that you're going to see is alternate. And so that the easiest way to remember alternate leaf arrangement is that the leaves are arranged alternatively on the stem. Where if you look at the kind of the inverse of that, you have this opposite. And so that's where you essentially have two leaves attaching at the same node. And so if you look at these illustrations, you can see it looks like you have leaves opposite of each other. Another fairly common one is whorled. And so that kind of comes back to that palmately compound leaf type where you have a main stem and just kind of leaves coming from one central spot. That is called whorled. There's another classification called basal, but we're really not going to use that today. We will use that in the second seminar series where we discuss more herbaceous species. But these are kind of the three that we're going to focus on today: is opposite, alternate, and whorled. Another really important characteristic of leaves is what is that leaf margin and how does that leaf margin look? So we have a couple different classifications here. The biggest distinctions is being able to identify just whether it's an entire leaf. So you can see in this example, an entire leaf is one that has no lobes. So it looks kind of just like that picture. And then you have what some people call serrated, or some people call them singly toothed. And so they're essentially kind of look like a saw blade. Now the doubly toothed, or as some people call it, doubly serrated, are essentially a tooth with another smaller tooth inside of that first tooth. And I know that might seem kind of ambiguous, but as you see some of the examples we go through later, that will make a lot more sense. And the last leaf margin that we're going to kind of focus on is this lobed. And so that's what most people are familiar with. That's your maple leaves, your oak leaves. All those are pretty good examples of lobed leaves. And here are a couple other terms that we might use throughout. Another really important characteristic for plant identification is the concept of shade tolerance. So you have some species that are very, very well adapted to grow in low light conditions. You have other species that cannot grow in low light, and they essentially need to be kind of in wide open areas. So those are going to be the species that are shade intolerant, because essentially they're, again, intolerant to shade. And then we also have shade tolerant. So those species will tolerate shade. Another very important distinction is this concept of deciduous versus evergreen. So deciduous trees are going to be plants that shed their leaves seasonally, where evergreen are basically plants that have leaves throughout the year, and they're kind of always green. So you can think of your cedar trees, your pine, your spruce, as well as firs. But we're going to first start where most people are kind of familiar, especially as hunters. Oak trees are one of the more common and abundant source of wildlife food in Illinois. They're very hardy trees with extremely long lives, and they also obviously produce acorns that are readily consumed by kind of most wildlife species. Even birds will eat on acorns. Waterfowl love acorns, wood ducks especially. Oaks do have alternate leaf arrangement. And so this is where it's really coming, some of those terms we discussed earlier are starting to kind of come in. And so that's very typical of how plant species are basically grouped or how they're categorized. A lot of times they're based on some of those characteristics like leaf type, leaf arrangement, leaf margin, things like that. And so knowing that all oak trees are alternate, if you see an opposite plant out there, you automatically know that that is not in fact an oak. And so you can start to see how some of these will kind of really influence our identification. Another really kind of cool characteristic of kind of oak trees in the oak family is that the younger trees often retain their leaves throughout fall and winter. If you're ever in the woods in kind of late fall and winter, you know, a lot of the trees overhead will have lost a substantial amount of their leaves. But you can see little oak trees kind of intermingle through there that will still have a few clumps of leaves kind of hanging on the trees. And that's really advantageous in terms of trying to identify it. As you'll kind of learn throughout this presentation, there are some people who can identify trees based on, you know, the form of the tree as well as kind of the bark characteristics. But we're really going to be focused on what that leaf looks like and what that leaf tells us. And so it's really cool that oaks kind of retain those leaves just a little bit longer. It does make that identification process slightly easier. The flowering and fruiting period for oaks, it's going to occur in late spring, once kind of all that frost danger has passed. They're going to start dropping acorns kind of late September through October is when you're going to see the peak acorn drop. And again, that's a really abundant food source for many wildlife species. Now that we've kind of discussed oak as kind of this overarching category, I want to take it a step further because there's some really specific considerations in regard to oak trees that we need to think about and pay attention to. And the easiest way to describe it is the oak family, the oak group is essentially broken into two subgroups. So you have the red oaks and you have the white oaks. And now we've all heard people call trees a white oak or a red oak. And there are specific red oak and white oak species, but they're also entire groups. And so we're going to kind of go over the distinctions here because it's very important as a hunter that you kind of understand how these two distinctions play. So red oaks, it essentially takes an individual acorn 2 growing seasons to mature, where a white oak, it's going to take 1 year to mature. So that means, obviously, the white oak is more susceptible to flooding events, to seasons of drought, because they only have that 1 growing season per acorn, where the red oak, it essentially has 2 growing seasons. So if 1 growing season maybe wasn't as productive as another, it still had that at least 1 year of solid growth. And so that can kind of pay dividends. If you start to see that you're just not having a big white oak crop out there on the landscape, you may shift your efforts to red oaks. However, red oaks are higher in tannic acid content, so that does make them taste a little bit more bitter, and so they're not as sweet as the white oak acorns. So the white oak acorns are the preferred acorn for most species, particularly white-tailed deer. They are always going to prefer a white oak acorn over a red oak. But again, that red oak has that extra year growing season that can allow it to produce a good acorn crop when the white oaks may not be able to. Another really interesting thing to pay attention to is obviously the white oak acorns are the preferred, so they're going to get eaten up quicker. So that's going to lead to them not being as prominent on the landscape over time. What also happens is due to that lower tannic acid content is that uneaten white oak acorns tend to decompose at a much faster rate than the red oaks. So later on through the seasons, it might be advantageous for you to switch your efforts from white oak producing areas to red oak, as you kind of see that shift in feeding behavior. And so being able to identify what some of these characteristics are can really pay off as a deer hunter. So how do you tell the difference between a red oak and a white oak? The easiest way is to simply look at the leaf. As you can see, these are two oak leaves from different species of trees. These are both what we would consider lobed leaves. And again, oak leaves are alternate, so these would be alternating along the stem. But if you look at the tips of the lobes, particularly on the leaf that is on the left, you can see it has all the lobes kind of come to a really sharp point. At the end of these lobes, they have what botanists call them as bristle tips. So they're just this kind of little hair-like projection at the tip of that lobe that is only present on members of the red oak group. So if you ever see those bristle tips and see those, sharply tipped lobes, that's going to instantly tell you that that is in fact a red oak or an oak species in the red oak group. And so now we'll start kind of diving into more specific species, and we're really going to kind of dive into how to identify these species, but also how they're utilized by different species of wildlife. First thing, we're going to start off with the white oak. Again, this is going to be in that white oak group of oaks, and again, they are alternate on the stem. White oaks are typically found in kind of more moist soils, but they can also be present on dry slopes as well as wooded slopes. So that kind of tells you they're a very advantageous species. Um, they're not as picky in some of their habitat requirements and some of their soil requirements as some of the other species that we'll detail in a little bit. But the really cool thing about white oaks is their bark. And I wish we had a better picture here to illustrate that. But white oak bark, it's known to be very platy. If any of you have ever seen a shagbark hickory, it's kind of this, it's a tree that just has this real platy bark that kind of looks like it's just slowly peeling away from the trunk of the tree. And white oaks are known for that. And it's a really useful kind of hiding spot and cavity nesting spot for bat species. And so they're, again, these are not just used by game species, but also by non-game species. So they do have that really platy, peeling bark, and that is a very, very good characteristic for the white oak. The white oak gets its name from that bark. As you start to be able to pick up on it, you'll see it's a very kind of light silvery white. And that is where it gets the tree, or it gets its name. So again, the leaves are going to be arranged alternately on the stem, and they're typically going to have 7 to 9 rounded lobes, and they're about 10 inches long. And one interesting kind of caveat that I want to mention before we get too much further is that the white oaks, actually most tree species are going to have kind of 2 different types of leaves, for lack of a better term. So they're going to have sun leaves and shade leaves. So the sun leaves are going to be very kind of shriveled up and not as prominent and as big as the shade leaves. And that's kind of just due to basic physics. You need a bigger surface area in the shade to get kind of the same photosynthesis-like reaction. And so I typically really prefer, when I'm trying to identify a tree, is to make sure I'm looking at both a shade leaf and a sun leaf, because if you just focus on one, it might eventually lead you to a different identification. So just kind of keep that in mind, is to try to focus on both a sun and a shade leaf. And yeah, that's kind of the white oak. Again, they're a very prominent deer food source. Wild turkeys absolutely adore white oaks. Again, the acorns are going to be less bitter because of that lower tannic acid content. And so a few notable species that I just kind of want to mention. I think we're going to do that for kind of every species we go through, is just list a few different species that kind of use that individual plant that we're talking about. So again, white oaks are good for deer, turkey, wood ducks, many different bird species like pheasants, grackles, woodpeckers, rabbits, and squirrels. So there's a lot of different wildlife value in terms of the food. Up next, we'll talk about the pin oak. And now the pin oak is one you see very commonly in more kind of commercial areas. You see it a lot on college campuses or in different local park districts or even in subdivisions. It's a very common tree that's used, kind of landscaping. And a lot of that is due to the overall shape and form of the tree. And so if you can see this example of a pin oak is what the majority of them look like. They're very straight, they're very uniform. They typically have, just an overall shape that's very symmetrical and very even. It doesn't have a lot of these, just bigger branches that come off of it. It's typically going to be one major trunk that goes down and just has little branches coming up. Now, they're also known for typically having distinctive dead branches on the lower trunks. And that's again why they're really common in terms of landscaping, is because once those lower branches essentially die, you can break them off. It's not going to harm the tree at all. And then you have kind of this park-like area beneath it. So those first, limbs are going to be very high because those first few ones died. And so it's very commonly used on college campuses. But the name pin oak actually comes from kind of the many slender twigs. And so if you just kind of look at this picture, you can tell it doesn't have, you might even see these pictures and think that's not even a mature oak, just because it looks like it's very young. It's got these very spindly and slender twigs. That is very common of the pin oak. But I want to pay really close attention to the shape of this leaf. And so we have these lobes. So obviously this is a member of the red oak subgroup. So you can see it's got those very pointed tips. And Jake, I saw your question. You mentioned landscaping. Is the pin oak a native Illinois species? Yes, it is. It is native. And so if you look at this pin oak leaf, you can see how it has these real deep lobes. And so those areas that are kind of lacking leaf material are considered the sinuses. And so on pin oaks in particular, that sinus is very, very deep. And so you can see how deep those lobes are. They almost go all the way to kind of the middle of that leaf. And so that is a very telltale sign of a pin oak. We'll cover a few species later on that have a similar leaf to the pin oak, but they don't have that really distinctive, deep kind of sinus-like cavity that the pin oaks do. Pin oaks are a fairly smaller sized acorn, particularly if you're going to compare it to like a white oak. It's going to be substantially smaller acorn, and so that leads it to a lot of other species that use it. It's a very common species, kind of browsed heavily by wood ducks. So you're typically going to find pin oaks in more wet soils if they're out in the wild, and so they're a very popular wood duck food source is the pin oak acorns. They're also readily consumed by deer, by squirrels, and a lot of bird species. Up next is the shingle oak. And this is one, if you are brand new to kind of looking at trees and trying to identify it, if somebody showed you this, the majority of people are not going to think that this is an oak. It does not have kind of that traditional oak style leaf. As you can see, it's got essentially simple and entire leaves. So these are typically found along field edges and woods. They really like disturbance. So anywhere that there's some kind of, whether it's mowing or a fence row, things like that, you're really going to find these shingle oaks. They really prefer that kind of disturbance. Like it really sets these guys off. Again, they're a typical oak, so they're going to be alternate. But again, the key characteristic is the shape of that leaf. It's going to be an entire leaf. And this one's really, really tough if there's not acorns on it, particularly as you're just starting to get into this, because again, it just kind of looks like a basic leaf. So seeing those acorns are kind of really important, just to at least get you on the right track, and then you can kind of go from there. But the shingle oak is basically what it sounds like. It's got oval shaped leaves that are untoothed and unlobed. The bark is kind of a dark browner, and you're typically going to find these guys in, like I said earlier, along kind of field edges, but more to that, they really like high sunlight. So they're very common in areas that get a lot of sunlight. And they're kind of in the same group as to kind of what readily feeds on them. Now, shingle oaks are in the red oak group. So they do have those acorns that have the high tannic acid content, but they're readily consumed by deer, turkey, squirrels, rabbits, rodents, and again, many other bird species. Up next, we have the swamp white oak. I think this is one of the cooler oak species that we have in Illinois, particularly due to the kind of coloration of the leaf. And so if you look at this bottom right picture, you can see the coloration, the bright white on the bottom underside of that leaf. And so that is kind of the dead giveaway that you're looking at the swamp white oak. And what that actual kind of white is it's what a lot of people call as pubescence. So it's basically hair-like projections on the underside of the leaf. And so that kind of creates that white texture. And you can actually use your fingernail to kind of scratch it off. And so if you happen to see a leaf that's got that white underneath side that looks like an oak, that is going to be the swamp white oak. And just like its name says, it's very common and very water-rich areas. So it's going to be found in your low woods, your bottomland swamps, occasionally other river riparian areas if they get regularly flooded. Now, they are usually found in areas where flooding is not permanent. They cannot tolerate water being on them during the growing season, but during the dormant season, there's no issue with these guys basically flooding, and they'll survive through that dormant season. So if you're looking for this, you're typically going to be in these more wooded areas. We had a question from Jake. Are they in all regions of Illinois? That's a good question. As far as I know, yes. Up next, we have the Bur Oak. This is a species found statewide, and it can grow in almost any habitat. It's one of those species that just, if you were a gardener, it's one of those you can't really screw up. You just plant and let it go. And it's got this really unique leaf. There's really not any other way to kind of identify or describe the species other than just by kind of, mentally retaining what that leaf looks like. It's very unique. There's nothing else like it. But one really important identifying characteristic on the Bur Oak is going to be the acorns. And so if you look at the acorns and just kind of look at them for a second and see what stands out. The biggest thing is the big acorn cap. And so as you start to look at oak species, you'll notice there's a lot of fundamental differences in what an acorn looks like, both in size, in color, and sometimes in shape, but also in that acorn cap. And so the Bur Oak is known for having this big burr-like acorn cap that kind of almost encompasses the entire acorn. And so if you do happen to see that acorn, it's going to be a Bur Oak. So again, the leaves are going to be alternate along the stem, just like all the other oaks. The leaves are going to be kind of broad at the top and kind of coarsely round toothed, and they tend to narrow as they come towards the twig. The whole leaf almost kind of forms like a diamond shape. And so what I was referring to about the acorn cap, some people call them cupules. I'm just going to go with the acorn cap just to keep it easy. But essentially, once you see that it basically covers the majority of that acorn, that's a pretty good indication that it's a Bur Oak. Bur Oak are eaten by a lot of things. They're a really heavily browsed species by deer and turkey. not only the acorns, but on the younger trees. I've seen deer eat the leaves and twigs and kind of the tender shoots. So those tender shoots are kind of the new growth out of that twig. They'll eat these fairly readily. Up next is the northern red oak. So the northern red oak, again, just like it says, it's in the red oak group. But one thing I want to point out before we get too much further is look at the shape and the kind of size of that acorn cap. You can see it's a drastic, distinct difference between the bur oak that we just looked at and the northern red oak. So those are just a few of the characteristics that you'll start to kind of compare between species, and you'll start to get to the point where you'll start to identify some of these trees. I call them 70-mile-per-hour trees, because you'll just be kind of driving down the interstate. Oh, shingle oak as you drive by. Eventually you'll get there. But northern red oaks grow in very rich upland woods. You're typically not going to find them in water areas. You might find them in riparian areas if they can be kind of up on a creek bank that doesn't regularly get flooded, or you're very commonly going to see them on well-drained slopes. So these are slopes that might get a lot of water on them, but they drain well enough that that water isn't retained on those sites. And so that's where you're typically going to find the northern red oak. It's got your standard oak bark, so it's just kind of dark gray brown. It doesn't really have any distinct characteristics until you kind of peel back the bark. Then you can start to see these dark stripes that kind of, it's hard to illustrate. But if you pull off a piece of the bark, so bark is almost, it's corky. So it's almost just like the cork out of a wine bottle. If you can peel a piece off of that, you can kind of start to see these dark stripes kind of inside that bark. Again, it's another northern or another oak. So it's going to have its leaves arranged alternately on the stem. The leaves are going to have these kind of 7 to 11 shallow lobes, and they do contain bristle tips. And so this picture right here is a very good illustration of the concept between a shade leaf on the left and a sun leaf on the right. And you can tell how those really almost look like they could be two separate species, but those are from the same plant. And it's just because the leaves in the shade need to have greater surface area to kind of have the same photosynthetic effect, so to speak. Now we'll move into the American beech. So this is one that most people probably don't realize is actually in the oak family. So the oak family is actually called the beech family, and the oaks just happen to be a member of it. But the American beech is one of those trees that's really easy to identify. If you've ever seen those stupid scenes in movies where there's kind of some romantic love interest, and the two teenage kids find some random tree in a park and start carving their initials into a heart. 99% of the time that you see that scene in a show or a movie, it's going to be on an American beech tree. And that is simply because it is known for having this characteristically smooth and kind of pearly grayish white bark. So it makes it really conducive for people to carve their names into it. Please don't do that. Now they are found more commonly on the eastern part of the state, and you're typically going to find them in hardwood forests. The cool thing about the beech tree is basically its fruit. So it's got a beech nut that contains very good nutrition for wildlife, and I think it's one of the most commonly overlooked species of trees in terms of wildlife food. And I think a lot of that is just due to its nature. So it's not a tree that typically forms, let's say, beech stands. You're more commonly just going to find a few beech trees kind of here and there, rather than a big beech stand. And so I think that's kind of where it leads to. But the nuts are very commonly eaten by turkeys. Wood ducks will commonly eat beech nuts, as well as deer, squirrels, and I think even foxes have actually been documented eating American beech nut. Another really good characteristic is the American beech is one of the first trees that will start to kind of transition its leaves in the summer. And they're not going to be red. They're typically going to carry a more kind of yellowish color to kind of a bronze color. And as you can see, one thing I kind of like to point out on the beech as well is look at the leaf venation. And so if you kind of pay attention to that as we move forward, you'll see that it's another pattern that you can start to identify based on different species. And so the American beech is very common for having these basically straight parallel leaf veins, where on a lot of the other species that we'll look at, they might be curved or oval, or they might be kind of like an oak and just go all over the place. So if you see kind of this characteristically straight leaf venation pattern, that's typically going to be on a beech, but the best characteristic for the American beech is looking at that bark. Now, I will go ahead and say a quick caveat about the American beech. If you are a deer hunter that uses a climbing tree stand, do not select that tree as one you're going to climb. The tree stands have typically a rough time at grabbing into that bark, and so it's very common to slide down those trees. So try to stay away from beech trees as your climbing tree. Up next is the pecan. Excuse me. Most people are probably familiar with pecan. It is a very cool tree. It's very culturally relevant, not only to kind of Americans, but Illinois specifically. The pecans, again, humans love eating them. Our ancestors loved eating them, and wildlife love eating them. These are, if you're interested in squirrel hunting, the next few trees are kind of really where you're going to want to focus, because they are going to be readily consumed by squirrels and kind of chosen as the top tier food choice for a lot of small mammal species. But the pecan tree has what we kind of discussed earlier, a pinnately compound leaf. And so you can see this picture in the bottom right. That entire structure that you're seeing is the leaf. And what you're seeing are the leaflets. And so that might be a little confusing because you might look at this and say, well, those look opposite. But pecan is alternate on the stem. And so what you need to essentially trace back to be able to see what is a leaflet versus a leaf is you're going to trace those leaflets all the way back to the node or to the stem. And you'll be able to see a little structure that looks like where a leaf is attached. And so that's going to give you the best indication of what is a leaf. And we do have a few more illustrations that'll kind of highlight that. But I really wanted to point out, since this is kind of one of our first species that we're detailing with the pinnately compound leaflet, or pinnately compound leaf, that I wanted to kind of point that out a little bit. But the pecan tree is, again, going to be found in very moist woods, typically not in areas that have water kind of retained on them for any duration. They typically like areas that might get a little water on them, but it's nothing substantial. So maybe 2 or 3 days out of the year it gets water, nothing too crazy. The bark is kind of reddish brown underneath, with kind of plate-like scales. Now the plate-like scales are nothing like the white oak or the shagbark hickory, but you do start to see a little bit of kind of those plate-like structures starting to peel off. Each leaf is going to be made up of kind of 9 to 19 different leaflets. The leaflets are going to be doubly toothed, so they're going to have one tooth with a smaller tooth inside of that bigger tooth. And a really important characteristic is that the leaf is going to be smooth. The leaflet is going to be smooth on top and hairy on the underside. And we'll get into why that's important in a few different species later on, but just remember that the pecan tree is smooth on top and hairy underneath. The fruit is an ellipsoid nut that can typically be kind of 2 to 1 inches long. And the real interesting thing about the pecan nut is kind of that shape. And so like you see here, we chose the term ellipsoid. A few other species we'll get to have more kind of oval shaped or even more circular shaped. And so that overall shape is very important. But another important characteristic of the pecan is you can see kind of these raised ridges on that pecan nut. So if you look at that shell, you have kind of those 4 distinct ridges where that nut would typically peel apart. And you can just see how prominent and raised those are. that is a good characteristic for the pecan. As we get into a few other species, you'll see that that's not as prominent on different species. But pecan, again, are very culturally relevant. Early settlers loved these. I know I read an article a few years ago that they weren't only kind of used for eating, but they were also used them to kind of ship and market to the cities for cash. And so the pioneers would kind of go around just gathering as many pecans as they could. They would basically chop the entire tree down, harvesting that entire season's crop in kind of one day, and then just kind of leave that tree to rot. And so that kind of led to an overharvest of pecan trees. And so there was a lot of issues, in the early 1900s, there was a lack of pecans left kind of in the woods. And that was just because so many of them were harvested through. So I just kind of thought that was interesting. But the pecan is a great wildlife food source. If you are interested in squirrel hunting in particular, this is a great one to know, as well as kind of the next few. So up next, we have the mockernut hickory. The mockernut hickory is, I think it was kind of listed as the most abundant of the hickories. And I think a lot of that is just due to its kind of long-lived nature. There's been documentations of individual mockernut hickories living well over 500 years. But one thing I want to really kind of point out is its scientific name. And so scientifically, people utilize kind of Latin to classify different organisms. And so we have a genus and a species. So the genus for mockernut, or for hickories in general, is Caria, where the species is tomentosa. And so that term tomentosa comes from the Latin word tomentum, which actually basically means covered with dense, short hairs. And I know it might be hard to see in this picture. We tried to find the best one that would kind of illustrate it, but if you ever come across a mockernut hickory, you can see exactly where they got their name from, that tomentum, those covered in short, dense hairs. Basically, every part of this tree is going to be covered in hairs except kind of the trunk. All of the leaflets will, the leaf petioles will, the nuts, if they're at the right stage in development, they will be covered in kind of these short, dense hairs. And so that's the best way to identify a mockernut hickory, is once you can identify what a hickory tree is, and then you can just see, okay, this thing is covered with hairs, tomentosa, boom, mockernut hickory. Now, the best way to identify hickory trees in general, kind of an overall grouping of the group, is they're going to be alternate and they're going to be pinnately compound. There's very few pinnately compound species in Illinois. So you kind of start to get a gauge of what a hickory tree looks like. Another really kind of distinct characteristics of hickories is they never get near as big as oak trees. Typically your hickories are going to be a little bit shorter lived, except for the mockernut. And so that's why the mockernut is really popular in terms of squirrel hunting strategies, is because of how abundant they are in the landscape, but also because that nut is really preferred by squirrels. So mockernuts are typically going to be found on dry wooded slopes. They are fairly shade tolerant, so you can find them frequently in shaded areas. They're found in the southern 2/3 of the state more commonly. You can occasionally find them in the more northern portion of the state, but they're going to be very readily found in kind of the southern 2/3 of the state. Again, their leaves are going to be alternate along the stem. They will have kind of 5 to 9 leaflets. And again, the fruit is a nut that has a kind of small and sweet seed. Up next, we have the shagbark hickory. And I'm going to have Jason kind of flip back in between these two slides a few times, because one thing I really want to point out between the shagbark and the mockernut is the differences between the hickory nut itself. In the fall, it can be very difficult to identify hickory trees by their leaves. And so a lot of times I'm going to be using the individual nut, because those are going to still be covering the forest floor. They might, be eaten, but you're still going to be able to find that shell. And so I want to go back to the mockernut for just a second. And you can see how round these mockernut hickory nuts are. And a lot of that, you're gonna think, oh man, that's gotta be a big nut. But in reality, it's a lot of wasted space. Mockernut is gonna have the thickest hull out of all of the hickories in Illinois. And so if you find one, it's, you know, it's thick. It's a 1/4 inch, sometimes 1/2 an inch thick on that shell. And so that's a really good indication between different hickory species is what those nuts look like. So the shagbark is similarly shaped between the mockernut, but it's going to have a very thin hull compared to the mockernut. So we'll start off with the shagbark hickory. They're typically going to be found in upland woods. They really do not tolerate water very well, so they really like those kind of dry, drier areas. The bark is gray, and this is where it gets its namesake, is it kind of separates into these kind of long, narrow strands. And so you can just kind of envision it. It almost looks like the bark is just peeling away from the tree. And so again, that kind of like we mentioned with the white oak earlier, that pays off in dividends, as it acts as a really good roost site for many bat species. And so that's really important. But other than that, the shagbark hickory it's pretty nondescript in terms of its leaf. But another thing I want to point out is if you think back to the mockernut hickory, we said that leaf is typically, you're going to have leaflets between 7 and 9 leaflets on an individual leaf. On a shagbark hickory, you're more commonly going to have 5 to 7. So obviously there is some overlap there, but you can kind of view it this way. If you ever see a 9 leafleted leaf on a tree, you know it's not a shagbark hickory. But if it's a 5 or 7, that can get a little bit tougher. Up next, we'll move into the black walnut. So obviously, a lot of people are familiar with black walnut. It's kind of one of those trees that every forester kind of longs for. It's got a lot of worth in terms of wildlife value, but also in terms of economic value. But the black walnut are typically going to grow in richer woodland areas. And a good example of those is going to be riparian areas. So these are areas along streams, along creeks, or along rivers. But what I've found to be a little bit more common is that it's going to be on drainages or, you know, riparian areas that have water more often than they are dry. So if you have a lot of these, you know, real cyclical areas that just, you know, they flood for a week and then they're dry for, you know, 6 months, and then flood for a week and then dry for 6 months, that's not necessarily a good site for a black walnut, but you're typically going to find them in these very rich soils. The bark is going to be very thick and very dark black. The leaves, again, are going to be alternate on the stem. So just like the hickories, it's going to be a pinnately compound leaf on the stem. Now, this tree in particular, the black walnut, you might get it confused with the pecan if you were just alone looking at the leaves. But that's where kind of a few other things come into play. Particularly, again, the nut, but a really big characteristic is the way these leaf veins curve. And so if you look at this picture in the bottom right, you can see how the majority of the leaves almost kind of curve back towards the base of where that leaf would come off of the plant. And that's very common with black walnuts, not necessarily with pecans. But typically, black walnut, you're going to be able to spot from a mile away just by seeing these black walnut fruit on the ground. Everybody's probably familiar with these. We all played softball with them as kids. The Native Americans actually used black walnut as kind of they used it for food, they used it for dyes, and they even used it for ink. I know a lot of current people will kind of use black walnuts to dye different metals. So one instance is trappers. Very commonly, they'll go through and find a bunch of black walnuts and use that to kind of darken their tracks or darken their traps, but just by dyeing it. So if you do find one of these seeds on the ground, if you pick it up and start playing with it, it will eventually dye your hand and kind of stay in it for a couple days, but nothing too big. But the black walnut is really interesting in that, again, it's got kind of a unique adaptation. And so what people call it is allelopathy. And so essentially it's going to excrete different chemicals and toxins out of its root system into the soil that basically gives it an advantage over other plant communities. So typically, if there's going to be a stand of black walnuts, it's typically going to be, unless it's been logged or selectively harvested, 20 or 30 years ago, which is fairly common in Illinois. But you're typically going to find black walnuts in kind of a big group. And a lot of that, again, is due to this allelopathy, that they're just going to secrete these toxins and basically allow themselves to outcompete all other plant communities. And so eventually they're just going to start kind of overtaking that area. Now, I shouldn't say that. I guess they won't ever overtake an area, but they will become more prominent in the stand. The seed is very good for humans. I'm sure a lot of us have eaten walnut. It's very common food for woodpeckers, foxes, squirrels. Deer typically don't readily consume it, and you're going to start to see the nuts kind of falling in, I'd say early to mid-October is when you'll start to see the majority of them begin dropping. So that's when to pay attention to the black walnuts. Up next, we have the red maple. And so this next group, the maple family. A lot of people just kind of see especially hunters. And again, myself, I'm a hunter as well. So when I first started thinking about plant communities and kind of using it in my hunt planning process, I probably thought the same thing. Why do we care about maples? Deer don't eat maples, but in fact they do. And that's what we're going to kind of detail is, again, how can we identify these plants, but also how can we use them? Because a lot of people will focus on the acorns and on the hickories, but there's a whole other classification of plants out there that are very important to know as a hunter. So one of the most common and kind of widespread deciduous trees in eastern and kind of central North America is going to be the red maple. The U.S. Forest Service actually recognizes it as the most abundant native tree, and that a lot of people, again, kind of like I mentioned, view red maples as kind of pest that people believe is kind of overtaking forest and starting to displace other tree species and other stands of forest. But now that might be true in younger forest, but typically you're not going to find that in kind of a more mature forest. In kind of these mature forests, red maple only has a space presence while kind of shade tolerant. And so it's not readily going to consume more of these mature stands, but it can certainly start to take over a younger stand. But if it's an older mature stand, it's certainly not going to outcompete many other species. But the red maple, this is going to be our first species that has opposite leaves. So they're going to be arranged oppositely on the stem, and that is characteristic of all maples. All the species we'll cover today, as well as all the other species out there. It's kind of a characteristic of the maple family. Now, the red maple is kind of very adaptable. You're going to find it in obviously a wide range of habitats. You can find it in people's yards, at the school, but you can also find it in swamps, or you can find it in kind of the highest upland you can find in Illinois. There's probably a red maple up there somewhere, I would bet. So it's a very common species. Their leaves are going to turn bright red, and that's kind of been exacerbated over time in kind of the selective breeding community for planting these in your yard and things. So the trees you see out kind of in some of these natural communities are typically not going to have a lot of that deep red characteristic that you're used to seeing in more urban settings, but it will still carry over a little bit, particularly along the petiole. And so the petiole is the portion of the leaf that connects the leaf to the stem. So you can essentially view it as just that little stem that comes off the back of the leaf. That is the petiole. And that is what you're going to basically see all the time on red maples. Those are going to be kind of bright cherry red. Red maples are readily consumed by different rodents and birds. And these seeds are actually called a samara. We've all kind of thrown them, and they have this kind of cool dispersal effect. The helicopter as it kind of floats down, so it can kind of help disperse those seeds a little bit. But one thing that people don't realize is rabbits and deer will readily consume red maple. Now, it's not necessarily the seed that they're eating, but red maples are very, very good at kind of self-propagating. And a lot of that is due to those samaras. So it's got this unique dispersal effect that allows it to kind of cover a wide area. And so there's going to be lots and lots of little, 6 to 8 inch maple seedlings that are starting to come up out of the ground. And those are an excellent, excellent food source for deer and rabbits as well. Up next is the silver maple. And the silver maple gets its name again from the leaf. And so if you look at the underside of a silver maple, you see this really bright white silvery color. That is very characteristic of a silver maple. There is one other maple species that was introduced in Illinois, but isn't very common that you might see, but typically it's going to be a silver maple. Again, it's going to be opposite. It's going to have simple leaves, so that it's not pinnately compound, and they're going to be about 4 to 7 inches long, with five kind of major lobes. Silver maples are again common in Illinois, but kind of in comparison to the red maple, the silver maple tends to stay in very moist areas, where the red maple kind of has that capacity to spread to several different habitat types, and is just kind of more of a generalist. Silver maples are kind of more of a specialist in that they really like and prefer moist areas. So these are going to be your bottomland swamps, your forests, bottomland forest, or riparian areas. So again, along streams, creeks, or rivers. They're kind of consumed just the same as red maples. Their seeds are going to be consumed by different small mammals as well as bird species, where the deer and rabbits will kind of focus on that new tender shoot, that new growth that's just coming out of the ground. But the larger trees are typically hollowed out by heart rot. And so this kind of leaves a big empty cavity inside the trunk of that tree, and they make excellent squirrel den sites. And so squirrels are very commonly found amongst silver maples, just because silver maples have this very common tendency to get heart rot. And so, again, they do make excellent squirrel denning sites. Up next, we have the black or sugar maple. And so there is technically 2 species here. There's the black maple and then the sugar maple. But this is one of those I think is a little bit of, I don't know. In this instance, we're just going to kind of teach them as one species. The only real distinct difference between the two is that you'll have to use a hand lens to look at some of the hair-like structures on the underside of the leaf. As a hunter, that's really not important. But the black and sugar maple are not nearly as common as red maple, but I would say are kind of as common as silver maple. The black and sugar maple, you can see they don't have the level of serration that the silver maple does. It's a much more kind of standard leaf. If you think of kind of the Toronto maple leaf, this is a pretty good example of kind of what that looks like, is the black and sugar maple. But again, these are going to be opposite, simple, 3 to 5 lobes, and the sides of the lobes often have secondary lobes, which you can kind of see in these pictures, and very similar to the other maples that we've talked about. The seeds are going to be eaten by small mammals, and the tender shoots will often be eaten by deer, as well as rabbits and a couple other small mammal species. Up next is the green ash. And so this is kind of a whole new family. This is kind of the ash family. There are several species of ash, but we're really going to just focus on kind of 1 or 2 of them today. The green ash is an opposite leaved pinnately compound leaf. So very similar to the hickory. You can kind of see it looks fairly similar to a hickory. Now, one of the big distinctions, obviously, between an ash tree and a hickory is these fruits. And so you can see it has very maple-like samaras. And these are, again, called samaras. A lot of people will call them maple samaras. They will call those double samaras and call these single. But just know these are kind of the same type of fruiting structure. The seeds are, again, going to be eaten by many bird species, where the deer are going to typically focus on the leaves and on the twigs. One thing that is important to know about the ash species in general is that we have this critter called the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive species and has been basically, it's documented just devastating the ash population. And unfortunately, it actually can use other oak species as kind of a surrogate. So it can live in these oak species for a while without damaging those individuals too much, and then kind of switch over to ash. So we have started to see a substantial decline in the ash tree populations. And that's actually, you'll start to see a lot of, I know University of Illinois has started to remove a lot of their ash trees because eventually they're going to succumb to it and fall at an inconvenient time. And so it's a lot of time, it's just more convenient to do it now. And so that kind of just shows the level of effect that this emerald ash borer really does have on plant communities. And that's why you see a lot of these campaigns about not transporting firewood and these type of things. And this is a perfect example of why is the emerald ash borer, and it's substantially hurting the ash tree population. Up next is bush honeysuckle, kind of continuing along the introduced species line. Bush honeysuckle, again, is an introduced species. It was introduced from Asia, and it is kind of the definition of an invasive species. It is one of those species that just seems to take over everything. And similar to black walnut, like we mentioned before, bush honeysuckle also has this ability to secrete chemicals into the soil, kind of damaging all of the plant communities. And so if you actually go look at kind of the ground floor of a bush honeysuckle canopy, it is about as bare dirt as it gets. And not only is that outshading things at the top level from the leaves and kind of just the way that plant grows, but also because it's secreting these chemicals into the ground. And I saw we had a question, and that's a really good point, is how do you kill it? That's one of the worst parts about bush honeysuckle. I actually worked on a study in the Missouri Ozarks for a summer. And one of the jobs was they basically cut down all the bush honeysuckle the year prior, and we were going back in to do some kind of follow-up and track effort just to see how effective those treatments were. And if you just go in and remove honeysuckle, it will re-sprout out of that root system about as quick as it can. And so the best way to kill bush honeysuckle is going to be with chemicals. There's a bunch of different chemicals you can use. I'm not going to kind of dive into those specifics now, but the most conducive way on kind of a small scale effort to completely eliminate bush honeysuckle is to go in and cut the entire plant down and then go through and treat those stumps. So basically run some kind of saw through the stump and then treat that stump with some kind of herbicide. It will then suck that into the root system, completely killing the plant so that it doesn't have that ability to resprout. Now, one good thing about bush honeysuckle, I shouldn't say good, but it is the first plant to begin fruiting in the spring. It's the first plant to actually leave dormancy. And so you're typically going to be able to walk through the woods. Everything else will kind of be drab, gray, and brown. And you'll see, ooh, there's some bright green honeysuckle. And so that's a really good time to go through and apply some of these treatments. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I highly recommend you contact someone with more chemical experience, but it does give you that ability to kind of treat it at that point. It's also kind of one of the last plants to enter dormancy. And so you're going to see it bright green as every other plant starts to kind of enter dormancy. The leaves start falling off the trees. Bush honeysuckle is still going to be there, bright and green. Again, it has the complete ability to just overrun areas. It's one of the nastier invasive species that we have. And the worst part of it is that it provides very minimal wildlife benefit. Again, as I mentioned, it basically the underneath side of it is just bare dirt. So it just doesn't have that capacity. The berries are not very caloric heavy. I've seen a few studies that actually cited a few bird species that consumed bush honeysuckle, but it actually cost their bodies more metabolic energy to basically digest the individual fruit, more so than the caloric energy that they received from it. So eventually it's one of those things that just burns more calories than you're getting from it. So it is a nasty plant. It's one of those things that's very easy to identify just by, again, the kind of overall structure of the plant. It's going to be opposite leaved. The leaves are going to be very kind of just basic. It's going to look like a standard plant leaf. But the big giveaway is these red berries. The red berries hang around for a while, and they appear early, but everybody will know bush honeysuckle before you know it. Walk around Illinois for 10 or 15 minutes and you'll eventually see it. This is not a problem unique to Illinois. The entire Midwest is dealing with bush honeysuckle. So it is something that's kind of nationwide, unfortunately. Up next is poison ivy. So this is now we're going to kind of get into some of the more viney structures. So poison ivy, again, most people probably know it as leaves of three, let it be, and that's the best way to identify it. But one thing I really want to point out, and it's something that we have noticed a lot of hunters run into, particularly at some of our Learn to Hunt workshops. We may have a new hunter, practice putting up a tree stand. And 9 times out of 10, they might know that that plant is poison ivy and not to touch the leaf. But you can also get the same reaction from touching the vine. So if you look at this top picture, that big vine on the left is poison ivy vine. And the easiest way to be able to tell it's poison ivy is you can see these aerial roots, and you can see the way that it basically attaches itself to that trunk. A lot of the other vines, I think I think there may be 1 or 2 that have aerial roots, but aren't very common in Illinois. But the majority of vines will not cling to the side of the plant like this. They may kind of wrap themselves around it and kind of start to swim up, but they don't have this kind of connection between these root systems. And you can still get that same reaction from poison ivy just by touching that root system of that vine. So if you are climbing a tree or cutting down a tree, make sure that you checked for poison ivy vines beforehand. So again, leaves of three, let it be. The chemical in poison ivy that we've kind of been alluding to that causes a pretty severe itchy rash is known as urushiol, and it can spread across your body. Once you start getting and developing that rash, you want to get it treated pretty quickly. Otherwise, it can continue to spread. The berries are actually a very popular food source for songbirds. And now the berries do contain the same urushiol that the root system and that the leaves do. So as humans don't consume poison ivy berries, but they are a very popular food source for many songbirds. Deer will also very frequently browse on poison ivy foliage, twigs, and berries. It is very common to find poison ivy in woodland areas that get a lot of sun. So if you're in an area that may be a big tree fell and you had kind of a big opening in the canopy kind of appear, that's a very kind of that is the perfect scenario for poison ivy to just come in, take over that area for the first year or two, and then succession is going to start to take place, and eventually it'll start to die off again. But it really likes lots and lots of sunlight. Up next is a vine that a lot of people get not necessarily confused, but a lot of people will identify some of the younger version of this species as poison ivy, and that is Virginia creeper. So it can be considered a poison ivy lookalike, but remember, leaves of three, let it be. Virginia creeper has 5 leaflets. And as you can see, when we first started off today, we discussed leaf arrangement. We did alternate and opposite. We also had one more, which was whorled. And so this is a good example of a whorled leaf. And so what you're seeing is one individual leaf with 5 leaflets, and it is arranged whorled. Virginia creeper is very common. You'll see it pretty much along any woodland I've ever seen in Illinois. Got Virginia creeper growing on most of the trees. You'll also find it in more urban settings. It is a very common plant. Poison sumac is another one that you kind of need to keep an eye on. It does have that exact same urushiol chemical that poison ivy does. However, poison sumac is not very well documented in Illinois. I think there's only a few individual reportings of it, and those are in the very kind of northern portion of the state. But if you've ever seen a sumac tree, and again, I apologize for not putting one in here, we should have. But sumac trees you very commonly seen on the side of highways. If you ever see this kind of short, shrubby, 5, 6 foot tall tree that has this really unique fruiting structure that kind of sticks out from the top of it. It almost looks like basically like a huge grape clump of very small grapes. But those are sumacs. And so this essentially looks identical to that. But it's very common in other states, but it's not very common in Illinois, but it is found in kind of the more northern portion of the state. And it's typically going to found in very, very wet areas. Up next is grapevine. And so this is kind of those big Tarzan-like vines you see draping down out of some of the bigger trees. Those are going to be grapevine. There's several different species, but we're just going to kind of lump them all together today. So the grapevine, the leaves are going to be alternate, and they're going to be about 6 inches long. Now, the real challenge about grapevine is there's a lot of variation in leaf shape and leaf size. So typically for grapevine, I'm just looking for the actual vine structure if that's something I'm trying to identify. But again, it's pretty easily to identify. We've all seen those big Tarzan-like vines dangling out of trees. Those are grapevine. And they do provide excellent food source, both for deer, rabbits, and other small mammals, especially as kind of that new growth appears. Grapevines are kind of known for rapid growth. They grow a lot and they grow quick. And deer really like kind of that new growth because it really packs a lot of nutrients into that bite. And so they will regularly consume grapevine growth. Greenbrier, this is one that everybody's probably felt dig into their shin or on their arm or on their leg as they've walked around the woods. Again, there's a lot of different species of greenbrier in Illinois. But again, it's that thing that everybody that grabs on your leg every time you walk through a prairie or through some woodlands. So they've got these real shiny leaves on the top, as well as thorns kind of throughout the plant. The leaves are kind of oval. Again, different species might have differently shaped leaves, but typically the majority of them are going to be just kind of oval. And again, they're terrible to walk through, and they're found all over the state. And they can be found in a wide variety of habitats. So you might find them in woodlands, in prairies, in kind of open areas along the edges. And they're very, very common along kind of power line cuts. So they're another one of these species that really likes disturbance. That kind of once that canopy opens up and allows some sunlight through, these kind of early successor species move in rather quickly. And greenbrier is a perfect example of that. Multiflora rose is another invasive introduced species in Illinois. We do have several different native rose species, but the best identifying characteristic to identify um, the introduced version or the invasive is if you go to one of these pictures at the top where you have a flower, if you trace all the way back where that flower touches the stem, you'll see kind of these hair-like structures. And you can also see it in the bottom picture right there, kind of in the upper left near those flowers. And that is basically the structure you're trying to look for. If that structure is fringed, kind of like it is now, where it looks kind of cut up and hair-like, that's going to be the invasive species. If that's one solid structure, that stipule, so that portion where it comes off the stem, if that is one single structure and doesn't have these hair-like kind of fraying, so to speak, in it, then those are going to be some of our native rose species. But rose in general, they're found all over the state. You can find them again in a wide variety of habitats, but they're typically going to be found in more open areas. They need a lot of sunlight, and so that's where you're going to find them. It might be in prairies, but they can also kind of manage their way. If there's a few random pockets of sunlight and some forests, they can kind of find their way in there as well. But they're typically going to be more commonly found in some of the more sunny areas. Up next is the hackberry. We actually have two kind of I don't know what I should call them, but there's two species that are very similar. So we have the hackberry and the sugarberry. We're going to just kind of focus on them as one group today because again, it basically takes a microscope to try to identify the two. Um, they're going to be found statewide, and they like bottomland woodlands. The bark is very gray and warty. I think we might have a picture of it on the next slide, if I'm not mistaken. But if you think of, let's say the beech tree that we talked about earlier, where it's got that real smoothie bark. If you can just imagine that with kind of warts just randomly scattered over over the course of the tree, that's basically what the hackberry looks like. So it's this very smooth bark with kind of these warty cork projections. The leaf is what most people call cordate shaped, so that's heart shaped. It is singly serrated, and the real big characteristic that I utilize to identify hackberry is the base of that leaf. So if you can see how uneven it is at the base of that leaf, you can see on one side is kind of shorter, one's bigger. That characteristic holds true for the majority of the leaves on that tree, and it's not very common on other species. So that's one of my main characteristics I use is looking at that base of the leaf. But hackberry, again, they are a fruiting tree, and their fruit is going to start to ripen in September and start to kind of peter out as we get through October. And being a fruiting tree, basically anything that can reach the fruit will typically eat it. So deer will, rabbits, squirrels, if it falls, lots and lots of bird species. So it is a good plant to kind of think about, but it's not one that's extremely common on the landscape, and it's not something I would probably shift, let's say, deer hunting efforts to focus on the hackberry area, but it's certainly worth paying attention to. And here's that good illustration to show the hackberry bark. And so you can see how it basically looks almost like an American beech, just with these random kind of cork-like warts on the trunk of the tree. Now this one most people are probably familiar with. This is the southern flowering dogwood. And I think it's a very cool tree because I kind of, in my head, I view, the flowering period of the dogwood as kind of the sign that spring is here. It's also pretty correlated to a lot of different wildlife activity. The bass really start to spawn once the dogwoods start flowering. So it's really just kind of a sign that spring is here. And so most people are probably familiar with the flowering dogwood, but a lot of people are more familiar with it in kind of an urban setting. It is a tree that can be commonly found in Illinois woodlands. It's got kind of a rounded crown, and it's what I call kind of an understory tree. So it's a very small tree. It's not going to get to the size of some of the oaks and hickories and pines and things like that. It's going to be this kind of nice, pretty, showy understory tree. The fruit is kind of a red berry that's about a ½ inch long, and they're kind of clustered, and they make excellent food for a lot of different birds, but also deer. I've seen plenty of deer in the springtime. Just kind of sticking their necks up and eating off of dogwoods just because of the structure of the tree. Those berries typically reside at a height that deer can manage to reach them without too much trouble. So that is the flowering dogwood, and these are opposite. And they have leaves that are shaped kind of just like your standard leaf. It almost looks like a hackberry leaf that just has that doesn't have that uneven base. But again, flowering dogwood, it's a small understory tree, flowers in spring, and it's cool. It's a good tree. Up next is the Osage orange. Some people will call these hedge apples. This is another non-native species, but is a species very common in Illinois, and it's one of those species that I see a lot in very certain areas. It seems to readily just overtake an area, and it's fairly common on a lot of DNR sites I've been to. You can find stands of these. They don't have a ton of wildlife benefit. I have personally seen deer kind of paw and eat at some of these Osage orange, particularly at kind of the end of deer season. So mid to late January. when there's snow on the ground, I've seen them kind of paw and start to eat them, but it doesn't look like they kind of readily use it. I think it's more opportunistic in that case. So I certainly wouldn't focus my efforts on these Osage orange. There are thorns on this tree. Now the dead giveaway for these trees is that big fruit. That fruit tends to stay around on the ground for it seems like forever. There's one near our office, and every other day you just see 10 new fruits just sitting on the side of the road. So it's just one of those things that you're going to see the fruits left. The bark is very interesting. You can start to see kind of an orange-ish tint to the bark, and obviously that's where the tree gets its name. But it's also very commonly used in bow making, so for archery. So Osage orange the wood has a very unique characteristic in that it's very bendy and very pliable. It's not very brittle, and so it makes excellent archery equipment. And so it's been used for decades for that. But typically, again, it doesn't provide a ton of wildlife benefit. Up next is the persimmon. So this is another example of a common fruiting tree in Illinois. And if you've never seen a persimmon, I challenge you to try to find one and try to convince somebody else to eat one. And I don't actually mean that, but what I mean is the fruit is actually really good if you time it right. And so there's a very short window of opportunity where it's palatable, both for humans as well as for wildlife. And kind of my joke earlier is meant to transition that if you were to eat these persimmon fruit prior to them being completely ripe, it'll give you kind of a cotton mouth like you've never had before. It's one of those things that the second it hits your tongue, it just instantly sucks all the moisture out of your mouth. And it's one of those that just has that lasting effect. It's not overly tart or sour, but something in it just has that capacity that it just sucks all the moisture out. And it's the same for wildlife. So you're not going to see many species feeding on persimmon until it hits that peak fruit and ripeness, and then it's going to be gone within a week or two. So if you are able to find persimmons, it can be advantageous for a week or two if you're interested in using it to maybe bring in some deer to an area or something. But other than that, it's pretty difficult for most species of wildlife to eat. It does produce, again, these giant berries. So they're going to be orange and purple, and they're going to be very sweet and edible when they're ripe. Now, if you look at this picture at the bottom, that is what a typical persimmon leaf looks like. So it's very nondescript. Obviously, it doesn't have any serrations. It doesn't have any lobes. It's alternate on the stem. And so it looks like just a lot of other species. But one of the dead giveaway of the persimmon is that fruit. And so this is a tree I still struggle with to this day. If it's not in fruit, it's very hard for me to identify. But just keep it in mind that it is common. It's fairly common in Illinois and fairly common out there. Up next is the white mulberry. This is another one of those species that really loves sunlight and really likes disturbance. You're going to find it along roadsides, in ditches and open woodlands, as well as along the edges of prairies, and kind of all over. So the white mulberry, it's what most botanists call it is polymorphic. So if you look at this top image, you can see you essentially have what looks like 3 different leaves on one stem, but they all look like they're from different plants. And that's what polymorphic means. There's a few other species in Illinois that have this characteristic, but white mulberry kind of shows it more than any. So it can have leaves that are about as lobed can get, to leaves that are kind of entire with no lobings. But the really good characteristic of the white mulberry is if you ever kind of see a leaf shape that looks like this, if you were to rip one of those leaves in half, you're going to start to see kind of a white cloudy sap start to kind of drip out of that leaf. And that's latex, but it's a really good indication that is in fact a white mulberry. So I still use that to this day. I was walking around the woods this morning and I was struggling to identify a random plant, and I ripped a tree. Oh, it's a white mulberry because you had that nice white milky sap inside the leaf. So if you're ever trying to identify a white mulberry, that's kind of the best thing. Again, the fruit on mulberry are delicious. I'm sure many of the individuals here have eaten them. They're readily consumed by both humans and different wildlife species. And again, they're very common in Illinois. Up next, we have the common blackberry. So this is another one that most people know just because it sucks walking through. Um, Blackberry are typically found in more sunny areas. So you're going to find them in areas that are either recently logged, recently mowed. You'll find them in prairies. And again, they're a very critical component to a lot of the wildlife in Illinois. And a lot of people don't realize that, not necessarily just the food aspect, but also the cover. And so blackberries are very common. If you've been in a prairie, we always, there's always some random spot that are big blackberry thickets, where blackberry has just started to overtake that prairie stand. Well, that's actually a really good thing for a lot of different wildlife species. In particular, northern bobwhite quail. So northern bobwhite quail are, again, a prairie grassland species, but one thing that a lot of people don't realize is the amount of woody vegetation that northern bobwhites need to survive. Pheasants are a little bit different. They can survive in more big grassland areas that are just kind of a monoculture of prairie grasses, but quail really, really, really need some kind of woody vegetative structure that allows them to survive through winter. And so blackberry is an excellent case for that. So if you're interested in quail hunting, when I'm out in the prairie looking for quail, one of the first places I typically go to, especially if it's a really cold, windy, snowy day, is to try to hit up some of those blackberry thickets, because they're going to be in there trying to get away from the snow as well as get away from the wind. Blackberry, they're going to be fruiting June through August. I actually ate a bunch I picked this morning. So you can go out right now and you'll find lots of blackberries. Deer are going to be readily feeding on them at this time, as well as many different bird species. Rabbits absolutely love common blackberries. And so kind of many different species will utilize blackberries. Up next is the smooth sumac. And I'm glad this is in here. As we were kind of trying to discuss the poison sumac a little bit earlier, this is kind of that fruiting structure I was trying to describe, is this smooth sumac. So there's a couple different species of sumac in Illinois, and we'll just kind of run through them really quickly, but the smooth sumac is kind of the most common. But one thing I do want to point out is the berries. That there's actually a lot of documentation of Native Americans using the fruits to essentially make kind of a lemonade style drink. I've personally never tried it. I can't vouch for it, but I just found that interesting one day. So yeah, but the leaves are pinnately compound, and there's going to be a lot of leaflets on each leaf. So there's typically about 15 to 23 leaflets, and it's a very long leaf. It's about, a foot to a foot and a half length. Typically, you're going to find these alongside of highways. That's kind of the best example is just driving down the interstate. And you'll eventually see these fruiting structures, but they're kind of a moderate-sized shrubby tree that about 5-6 foot is kind of all they'll get. They won't get much taller than that, but the fruit does provide a lot of wildlife benefit for different small mammals as well as a lot of the bird species. Up next is the wild black cherry. And so this one is one of the harder native trees to identify, particularly when you're first starting out, is the wild black cherry. It's typically found along wood edges, fence rows, and thickets. But the big characteristic I want to focus on for this one is looking at the bark of the tree. And so if you look at this bottom left picture, I want you to just kind of look at it for a second and see what stands out. And I'll tell you what stands out to me is these horizontal structures that are running alongside of that tree. Those are called lenticels, but they're something for gas exchange, but essentially they're found on black cherries. And so that's a really good indication, is seeing these horizontal lines on the bark. And so that's kind of the number one characteristic I look for. And once you start to be able to pick up on those lenticels on the bark, you'll never have to look up for a black cherry again. You'll just be walking through, not even paying attention to the tree. Oh, there's a black cherry. It's one of those that once you learn to look for those horizontal lenticels that you'll pick up on it rather quickly. The fruit is a drupe, which is kind of just a fancy different classification of a fruit, but it's kind of a dry material that then starts to turn into kind of more of a fleshy fruit-like material. And it's readily eaten by lots of different wildlife species. Again, your small mammals, as well as many bird species. Up next, we have the eastern redbud. So this one is, again, most people are probably familiar with seeing this in kind of an urban setting, but it is fairly common in the Illinois landscape. The number one characteristic for the eastern redbud is the shape of that leaf. And so it's cordate shaped. It is about as perfect of a heart shape as you can possibly get. In the springtime, they're going to have these bright pink flowers. And in the summertime, those flowers are going to turn into seed pods. So this eastern redbud is a member of the bean family, technically. So it will have that pod, that kind of bean pod-like fruit as it fruits. But for the eastern redbud, again, it's a smaller understory tree with those really cordate shaped, heart-shaped leaves. And one thing I want to point out on eastern redbud as well is if you look at the shape of the stem in the bottom right picture, you can see how it's kind of zigzag shaped. Now that is characteristic of most alternate arranged trees, just due to the nature of the way alternate leaves will grow. It'll create kind of this zigzag-like pattern. That appears to be a lot more pronounced on the eastern redbuds. So if you ever do find one, just kind of pay attention to that zigzag pattern. And that's something you can kind of use moving forward. But it's fairly prominent on the eastern redbud. Up next is the bald cypress. This is probably one of my favorite trees. Unfortunately, I live in central Illinois, so it's not very common out here. You're typically going to see it in the southern part of the state, as well as into Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a very prominent tree in the South. But it's kind of characterized by these unique knees at the base of the tree. And so these knees essentially they adapted to basically grow out of the water. So these trees can survive entirely covered with water, and those knees will actually start to grow up out of the water. And that allows them to gas exchange essentially. And so if you ever see a tree with knees like that just kind of have this big rooting structure that's vertically shooting out of the water, that's going to be a bald cypress. Now, occasionally you will find people planting bald cypress in their yards and in more urban settings. Urban foresters are starting to shift away from that just because they're not really suited for that environment. Obviously, they're a very wet suited species, but also what they've noticed is over time, these knees start to develop even in an urban setting, and then you have some issues with mowing and things like that. So occasionally you will find them in an urban setting, but typically they're going to be out in kind of the South. They're very reminiscent of kind of that Louisiana bayou style. Up next is the eastern red cedar. This is one most people are probably familiar with, so we won't spend too much time here, but it does make excellent bedding cover for deer. It also can make really good winter cover for other different wildlife species. But one thing I really want to point out is eastern red cedar is an indication of an acidic soil. So if you're ever in a woodland or different areas where you see eastern red cedars becoming more prominent, that's a pretty good indication that is a more acidic soil, which will start to influence what other plant communities can live there. So typically, you're not going to find eastern red cedars very commonly amongst oaks, for instance. And so just kind of keep that in mind that plant communities kind of give and take, so to speak. So the eastern red cedar, yes, they like acidic soil, but B, they also make the soil more acidic. So over time, it will cause a lot of those other plant communities to die off or to start to move and disperse out. But it does make really good wind cover if you're trying to do some kind of wind breaks or things like that. It also does make pretty decent bedding cover for deer. Up next is the river birch. So this is found across most of the state, found in very, very flooded areas. So you're going to find it along floodplains. Typically in Illinois, you're going to see it right along kind of streams and creeks, typically in kind of that 5-year floodplain. So where it gets water on it, you know, once or twice every 5 years, not regularly, but not very infrequently either. The biggest characteristic for the river birch is this paper-like bark that just looks like it's peeling away from the tree. That's the pretty dead giveaway. The fruit is a small nut that's, again, going to be readily consumed by small mammals as well as some other bird species. Black willow is another species that is commonly found right alongside of the river birch. So this is another species that really, really, really likes to live in wet areas. And the real big characteristic that I focus on for the black walnut is, one, where it lives, so very wet soil, wet conditions, and two, the overall structure of the tree. So we've all kind of seen weeping willows in people's yards, and they kind of have this unique branching structure. That carries through a lot of the other willows as well. It's not near as prominent, but you can even look at this top picture and you know, it's just a very unique looking tree. And that's something you'll start to pick up on as you see more of these, is just the overall structure. But the leaf is very thin and very slender. So it's a very thin and slender leaf, unlike a lot of the other species that we've talked about. And again, you're going to find it in very wet areas across the state. Up next is the American sycamore. The American sycamore has alternate leaves, but on this species, I don't even think you're going to need to look at the leaves in most instances. This is one of those trees that I call the 70-mile-per-hour trees. As you look at this bottom right picture, you can see how as you kind of progressively go up the tree, those branches start to get wider. And that's due to the nature of the bark, the outer bark falling off. And so you can see that effect on these trees around the base of the trunk at the ground level. There's still going to be a lot of bark. And as you progressively go up the tree into the canopy, once you get to the very top, there's going to be very minimal bark, and it's going to be kind of pearly bright white. And so that's a pretty good indication. Now these, again, often have some kind of rot going on, so they make excellent cavity trees. In other tree nesting, there is lots and lots of squirrels that utilize different sycamore trees, either as denning sites or either as sites to build a dray, which a dray is basically a leaf nest up in a tree for a squirrel. That's a dray, and they'll often use sycamores as dray trees. Next, we have the American elm. Again, there are a couple different species of elms in Illinois. The American is kind of the most common. Again, all elm species are going to have alternate, simple leaves. But one thing I really want to point out is look at that bottom left picture. This is a doubly serrated species. So it's going to have one tooth with another smaller tooth on that big tooth. And that is kind of one of the biggest characteristics of an elm, is looking at that leaf shape and then knowing that it's doubly serrated. But also, elms are very commonly known for their bark. And so you can see it has these real kind of unique bark patterns. It's kind of this just gray brown, but it's more the structure of them. You can see how deep a lot of those fissures are and how pronounced the ridges are. And so that kind of leads to this real contrasty effect on the bark that makes it look a lot deeper than it is. And so that's a very good characteristic of elm, is the structure of that bark. So how it's got these real deep ridges, or real deep fissures, and elevated ridges. The American elm is used by a lot of different species. This is another species that shows a real prominent effect of that kind of zigzag pattern that alternate trees are known for. It's very common on elms as well as the eastern redbud, like we mentioned a little bit ago. Very similar to the maples, the fruit on an elm is going to be a samara. So they're kind of just these small, flat seeds that are pretty commonly eaten by small rodents, so kind of field mice and maybe moles, but typically not deer or anything, but deer will ingest some of the younger growth as well as maybe some of the leaves or twigs. But the fruit is going to be primarily consumed by small rodents and birds. Up next is the sassafras. So similar to the white mulberry that we discussed a few minutes ago, this is another species that has that polymorphic leaf. So it's going to have leaves that are several different shapes. So looking at this kind of bottom right illustration, you can see an example of a perfectly shaped leaf, of kind of one that looks like a baseball mitten, and then one looks like a W, and it can be kind of any combination of those. The easiest giveaway from sassafras, and if you don't believe me, go try it. Grab a sassafras leaf and take it in your hand and rub it together as fast as you can, and then smell the leaf. And it will smell like fruity pebbles, and I will bet everything I own that it will smell like fruity pebbles to you too. For some reason, it just creates that aroma, and that's a really good indication for the sassafras. Is if you ever get a weird leaf that kind of looks polymorphic and looks like this, just kind of take it off, rub that leaf in your hand, and you'll smell like Fruit Loops or fruity pebbles. It's typically found in central and southern Illinois. It's very common the further south you get. Typically, it's going to be found in savannas, woodland edges, thickets, and sides of ridges. And another interesting fact is, if you've ever heard of sarsaparilla, so it's kind of a root beer style drink, that was actually made using sassafras roots. I think there was a bunch of studies that came out and said that compound was a carcinogen, so I don't know if they're still producing it or not, but sarsaparilla was originally made from sassafras roots. Up next, the black locust. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this one just because of the way the tree looks. It's known to have really kind of gnarly looking thorns. And typically you're going to find it in more open areas. So along hedgerows and open fields, roadsides. Again, it's one of those trees that really likes disturbed areas with poor soil. The fruit is going to be kind of a bean-like structure that will be consumed by deer. It's certainly not their preferred food source, but they will readily consume it. And they, again, have these short briars on the branches, so these short thorns on the trees. And the leaves are pinnately compound with very, very, very small leaflets. The leaflets are probably an inch to maybe an inch and a half at the longest, as opposed to most of the species that we've talked about so far. And here's the gnarly one, is the honey locust. So this is typically found in upland areas. It needs dry soil. It does not tolerate water very often. Found along edges of fields and roads, again, very similar to the black locust. It likes poor soil and disturbance, but it has these really long thorns on the trunk of the tree, on the stem, just everywhere. And it's one of those gnarly looking trees. So it's something, once you see it, you probably won't forget it. I will note that horticulturally, they have started to basically genetically design these trees to not have thorns. So there are some thornless varieties that a lot of the park districts and some of these places might start to plant. So you might start to see that if you're ever out there confused. You're like, I know this is a honey locust, but it doesn't have those big thorns. It could just be a thornless variety. But very similar to the black locust, you can see it has these seed pod-like structures that have kind of this zigzag, or not zigzag, but spiral shape. They can be upwards of 1.5 feet in length, so they're pretty big size. Particularly compared to the black locust, they're going to be much bigger on the honey locust. And they'll be readily consumed again by livestock, as well as deer, squirrels, quail, and rabbits. I have noticed deer will eat honey locust more so than black locust, but I've certainly seen instances where it seems like they prefer acorns over both. So I would say honey locusts aren't really a preferred food source for deer, but it's something they will consume if it is available and there's not much else out there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jason.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Great job. I just want to thank Dan for the presentation he just gave there on a lot of information around plants. So again, we will provide you guys with a recording of this and the PowerPoint that you can go back and look over and try to study up on some of these and see if you can identify some plants on your property or on some public land that you've been hunting and use that to your advantage this fall. So we do have a lot more webinars coming up. So we took a little break in July and a little bit of August, but now we're going to be coming back through here in September. Mostly Tuesdays, Thursdays, a couple other days mixed in there, as you can see with our schedule. So you can look at that. You can register for these just as you registered for this webinar. So Deer Hunting 101 and some other 101 courses there for hunting. For people who are in here who are naturalists, we will have some more identification courses coming up. So again, that second plant ID that we're going to be coming up with is going to be coming out on September 15th. So if you find this educational and you're into identifying some plants, please join us for that one. And then also, if you want to learn to identify some waterfowl on September 26th, which is going to be a Saturday, you can sign up for that course as well. And on any of these courses, if you can't make it, we will send anyone who registers to that course a copy of the YouTube video when we get those published. So if you can't make it, that's okay. We'll send you the information. And any questions that you guys have or anything like that, please let us know either right now or in the meantime, you can send us emails or any questions you may have. We'll be happy to answer those. So those are the identification courses coming up, both of which are really fun. So if you saw any weird ducks or anything in the local park or if you're not a waterfowl hunter, this one will help you identify those odd looking ones that aren't just mallards. That's as far as my identification skills went before getting into waterfowl hunting and talking to Dan and everything. So with that, we'd like to say thank you for everybody for coming out tonight. Just a couple other things. If you can't make it to a webinar, we do have some e-learning modules on our website that you can go through if you want to learn how to do different types of hunting. We have waterfowl, deer, turkey, and upland, and those have similar information to what we have in our webinars, but you can work through those at your own pace. And at the end of each one of those, you get a little quiz there and you can test your knowledge and work through that. Unfortunately, as you can see in these photographs, our program tend to be workshops where they're in-person workshops, and we'd actually allow you guys to get your hand on some firearms or help learn how to butcher a deer or some waterfowl. We haven't been able to do those yet this year, given with the COVID as it is. But if ever in the future we're able to get back in doing those, we'll let you know. So we are through the University of Illinois. So they will dictate when we're able to do that. So we'll let you know when that opens up again. So good way to find out about all these different events and possible workshops in the future in the coming years. Please follow us on Facebook. It's a really good Facebook page to follow if you're interested in hunting in Illinois at all. We put up all the reminders for all the different lotteries that happen throughout the year. Any new regulations that come out, we try to highlight those. And it's just overall, I think, a nice Facebook page to follow. It gives you some good information. We try not to bug you all too much. We also have an Instagram page, so you can follow us on that as well. So with that, any questions that pop through, we can answer those. For anyone else who'd like to leave, have a wonderful evening. Appreciate everybody saying thank you. Yeah, Dan did a great job. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions, we can get going. You guys enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening, and I hope you guys have a great week. It's going to be a hot one here in Illinois. Fantastic. All right. We'll see you guys later. Thank you, guys.